let's make this large makeup bag together. This is a great Christmas project, and you could even use it as a gift. So here is the first one that I made that is like made from scraps. Kind of wanted to make things from like golden and pinks and things like that, but now I want to make one for Christmas. So this is a great fat quarter project. You need 3 fat quarters. And basically we need 2 outside pieces, and you could cut them both from 1 fat quarter. They're actually exactly half a fat quarter, so 11 by 18. And then I have a 14-inch zipper. And then we'll need a fat quarter for the outside, 1 for the inside, and then a 3rd one for our pieces here. So I'm just adding like this extra strip of fabric. This is going to be near the zipper. And I just want to make sure that all of this looks right. So if I lay out a big area of my overall fabric, then I can see if this is something that I think I would want in a bag. So here we're going to put this first sandwich together, and we're going to have 2 of them. One is for one side of the bag, one is for the other side. So we have our 11 by 18 inch piece of outside fabric, and then we're going to layer that with some quilt batting. And quilt batting, I have noticed they do have it at Michael's, and they have it in the craft size, so it's a nice small like 3 by 4 piece, so you don't have to get like a huge thing of quilt batting if this is something new for you. And then so this is the outside piece, the batting, and then the 3rd one is the inside of the bag. So mine happen to be the same, but you can obviously do a contrasting fabric for the inside of the bag. And we just want nice sides showing. And I'm using quilting fabric, which just means it is 100% cotton fabric. And this is great because once we're done, the inside of the bag is going to be fully finished. And this is a very simple, straightforward project that if you're a beginner, this would be perfect for you to learn how to quilt and to learn how to do these different things. And also a zipper. If you've never done a zipper before, this is a perfect project to learn how to do that. And it's, like I said, it's simple and direct and straightforward. Not a lot of steps here. So the first thing that we're going to do, we're going to just mark quilting lines. And I have like a chalk, it's like a chalk holder, but it's just white chalkboard chalk. And I'm just going to put this on the edge so that I can get a nice straight line. And I'm just going to go ahead and mark like all my quilting lines on this, and I'm just going to do them like 1.25 inches apart. And I'm going to try not to touch them too much because like if you mark a quilt, you only mark like a short small area at a time, because otherwise the marks might fade if you're using chalk. So I'm going to go ahead and mark these 1.25 inches apart, and then it will end up being about 7 lines of quilting. And that's, you know, it only took me about 3 minutes to quilt this whole piece. So this is our first piece. This will be 1/2 of the bag, and then we'll do one that's exactly the same, which will be the other half of the bag. So I have nothing special going on here, no special feet or anything like that. The only thing is, as a sewing machine needle, I use a quilting needle, but it's similar to like your normal universal needle. So if that's what you have, that will definitely work. So I'm just popping it in here, and I'm just going to go ahead and sew this. And I'm just sewing directly down these lines. And I just kind of picked like the width of these quilting lines just based on like what this fabric looks like. So when I do scraps, I might quilt it heavier, or if the pattern was different, I might do less lines of quilting. I just kind of see what it looks like and then kind of decide how close to put those lines of quilting together. So this is called straight line quilting, just sewing straight lines through the fabric. And a project on the road, I'm going to show you how to do the free motion machine quilting, which is really fun. And I quilt bed quilts on this sewing machine. This is the only one I use to quilt even big bed quilts. And it's totally doable, very simple, very easy. So here we have this piece done. And I am going to find, this is the outside fabric. I'm just going to figure out which one I'd rather have at the top of it. So for this project, you might want to do like an overall print rather than one that has a direction. But I do want to, you know, keep this kind of face up here. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to make sure that I add this strip to the top of it. So I'm looking at the outside fabric, and the way that I want it at the top. And now I'm going to flip it to the inside fabric, which for me is the same, but yours might be different. We're just going to add this on the inside fabric, and that strip is facing down, so good sides down as far as the strip goes. And then I'm just going to go ahead and add this by sewing a 1/4 inch seam, and all our seams will be a 1/4 inch unless I tell you differently. So we're using a 14-inch zipper, and all the dimensions of these fabric pieces are in the description. So you notice I put those quilting lines in the longer direction of this rectangle, and then this strip is the same thing. So we're using, these are 11 by 18, which is half of a fat quarter. So you can get 2 of those pieces out of 1 fat quarter, if you want to use fat quarters. I'm just using yardage, I'm using scraps. But if you do happen to have fat quarters, it will only take 3. Okay, so I just sewed that strip on and then trimmed it flush to the ends there. And now I'm just turning the edge in about a 1/4 of an inch. And then I'm going to bring that strip over the top of the seam that we just sewed. So we want that to be a little bit larger than a 1/4 inch. And you just want to be as consistent as you can when you're folding this strip over and sewing it. So I'm sewing it, just catching the edge of that folded area, and I'm just wanting to cover up the first 1/4 inch seam that we just sewed. So this is how we add binding strips, and this is how you would edge a quilt. So if you have quilted this piece and you can figure out how to add these binding strips, then you can make a bed-size quilt. This is how we do it, and there's nothing extra to it. So this would be a great project if you've never quilted before. You'd be able to make as big of a piece as you want and be able to edge it with strips. So, and the advantage to this of, you know, making a quilt is that if the edge wears out on a quilt, then you can just replace the edge and the whole quilt is fine. So it's a really nice way of doing that. So this is the only strip that we add to this piece at this point. And then we'll just go through this same process for our other quilt sandwich, and it will be the same setup and then the same strip that we'll add. So you can see the outside fabric here is where we've finished this strip, and that just ends up looking a little neater than the side that we start on. So I'll fold it over here and show that to you, how the inside looks. So it's completely finished, but the outside strip looks a little bit larger and a little bit neater. So that's why we do that on the outside fabric. So now we're going to work on our zipper, and we're just going to add those 2 5-inch squares that we need. We're going to add those, one on each side of the zipper. So we're going to line that zipper up on the right side there. We're going to have our square facing up, and we're going to have our zipper facing down. And now we're just going to fold, and did I say we're going to line that zipper up about a 1/2 inch away from where that metal tab is, where that zipper ends. It's going to be about a 1/2 inch from the right side there, and that's where we're going to sew. So that's going to be about a 1/2 inch seam allowance there. So we're going to fold that in, and then you see we fold that both times. We fold those edges back like that, and that way when we go to have the inside of our bag when this project is done, everything looks good. There's no raw seam there. So now we take that 1/2 inch seam here, and we're just kind of snugging it up to that zipper. And I'm just using my regular foot. I'm not switching it to a zipper foot, but you can if you want to. So now we just take that and we pull that inside out. And so for me, I pulled this out and I ironed it, and then I actually took a couple stitches at the end of it just to kind of keep it all in place. So now I'm taking the other side of the zipper, and this is the side with the zipper pull. And so for my zipper, I felt like I needed to open this, but if your zipper pull is smaller, you probably don't need to. And again, we're going to do that same process. So squares facing up, zipper is facing down, and we're aligning it where that little metal stop on the zipper is about 1/2 inch from the edge, the right edge of our square. And so I'm taking a little bit extra time to line that up since my zipper's open. I don't want it to get misaligned there. So I just fold it in, I fold that very edge back. We do the same thing with this bottom piece, and then now we're going to sew that 1/2 inch seam. Okay, so now we're going to sew that seam here. And this seam is small, so when you open it and check it, if something's wrong, you can always just pick it out and then re-sew it. But this is pretty straightforward, so it's generally not a problem to do this. So our zipper's 14 inches long. Our quilted pieces are 18 inches long. So that's why we're doing this. We're getting our zipper to be the same size as our quilted pieces. And in doing that, we're giving ourselves some fudge room here. So if you did want to, you could use a larger zipper, like a 16 inch. But I did a 14 inch because in my bag, I didn't want things falling out of my bag, since I'm using it for like makeup. So if you want it to zip all the way down the side, you can use a 16 inch zipper. So here I'm going to top stitch this quilted piece. I've got the outside of the bag showing, and I've got the right side of my zipper up. And what I'm doing here is just centering that zipper. So we should have about 2 inches of fabric on both sides of that zipper that match up with our quilted piece. But if your dimensions are off, that's okay. You just still want it centered, because all zippers are different. So now what I'm doing is I'm just going to top stitch this to the zipper, and I'm starting at the end of that quilted piece, and I'm kind of lining it up. So I'm doing the zipper teeth and then about 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 inch of that black zipper fabric showing, and then I'm just top stitching from there. The amount of like black zipper fabric that's showing is not as important as it is just to keep it consistent. So we just want to make sure that we're not like off the edge of that zipper, but you can see you have quite a bit of that zipper fabric, so generally that's not an issue. But I like to keep about 1/4 inch or like 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little bit more than that showing. I feel like that's the way most zippers are. And then if we get it too close to the teeth, you might have problems opening and closing the zipper, so I tend to keep that pretty consistent. And then we just sew this to the end of that binding strip on our quilted piece. And you're going to have a little bit of that fabric from the zipper kind of hanging out, but we're going to leave it alone for now. And I'm just sewing that, again, about a 1/16 of an inch away from the edge of my binding strip. But the distance isn't as important as just trying to keep it straight and consistent. So now you see you can just line up that edge with the first one. And both of these pieces, you want the outside fabric showing, and you want the good side of your zipper up. And then we're just going to do that same type of seam on the other side, just trying to keep it consistent from side 1 to side 2. And at this point, we do want to open that zipper. And you might want to just test the zipper, go back and forth a few times, make sure it's running smoothly. But then at this point, we're going to open the zipper and we'll keep it open while we sew the rest of the bag. And you can see those 2 pieces I'm pointing out there. That's our 5-inch squares. So whatever fabric you pick for those 5-inch squares, just realize that's about how much of that is going to show. So that might influence whatever fabric choices you're making. So here we're going to, the bag is basically inside out at this point, so inside fabric is showing, and we're going to sew that bottom seam shut, and we're just going to match up the bottom seam here, and we are going to add a 2" by 18" binding strip. And again, it just if you're using scraps or whatever you're using, just realize that this is going to be the bottom of the bag that you will see from the inside. And one thing I forgot to mention is that when I was finished quilting those pieces, I did go trim them up. They wouldn't be this nice and square if I didn't go back and trim them up. So if your dimensions are off, that's okay. It's just that you want the two quilted pieces to be the same as each other. So if something went wonky, that's okay. You just wanted to them to be the same as each other. That's the important part. This project is forgiving, so if they're not exactly the right dimensions, it will still work. So now I've added that binding strip, and I'm just now bringing it around to the other side. It doesn't matter which side you start with on this seam. We're on the inside of the bag. And we're just doing our normal process here. So for all of these so far, when we have these binding strips, we're just cutting them flush. And that generally is the way you do things until they end, and then we'll be fixing those corners at the end. So at this point, the bag is inside out. We're seeing the inside part of it, and I'm just going to quick pop it right sides out just to make sure that everything looks okay. And now I'm going to turn it inside out again, and now we're going to lay this differently. So it's inside out, but we have that bottom seam is in the middle now that we just sewed, and then it matches up to our zipper. And you can see having those extra pieces of fabric hanging out the side is helpful because we can use that to center the seam that we just sewed. So you want to center it on like your sewing line rather than on, you know, the binding strip itself. You want the last thing that you sewed, you want it to be lined up with that, because that binding strip is going to flop to one side or the other. But you know, we'll worry about that in a minute here. So we just want to, this is the sides of our bag, and now we're going to be working on those. So we're just going to clip this shut. And again, I'm going to say it over and over. We just want to make sure this is centered, because if it isn't, your bag is going to lean to one side or something else. I don't know what else would happen, but it's just not going to be like square. So now I'm going to take my ruler, and I'm going to measure 2.5 inches a square on each of these 4 corners. And I'm just using chalk. You could use a mechanical pencil if you have lighter fabric, but just something that won't run into your fabric. So I'm just going to draw my chalk outline here of a 2.5 inch square. And I'm going to do that on all 4 corners. And that gives us the boxy shape. So if you are sewing bags, and when you change this dimension, so again, this is 2.5 inch square, but if you change this dimension, it changes the shape of the bag. So for this, I was just really careful to measure it like repeatedly. And then, you know, when I had it all traced out, then I just looked, and I was trying to just make sure that it looked correct as well. Because of course, once you cut these corners off, you know, that's that. So. And I do save this material in case I can use it for like a tab or something later on. So that didn't look square to me, so I just wanted to double check it, that it was actually correct. Okay, so now we are going to work on our sides. And we're going to worry about those corners. That'll be the last thing that we do. And so that's how your piece is going to look. And of course, we still have those zipper, the initial squares that we put on that zipper. Those are still hanging out there. And that will help us continue to kind of like center everything. So that's why I leave those there for the moment. And so now we have 2 pieces of ribbon, and they're 2.5 inches long. So I just fold it, and I put the folded side towards the center here, towards the middle of the bag. And those cut edges, I just line that up with the edges of this bag. And I'm just being careful to clip this so that it stays centered and that it's not, there's no wrinkle in that ribbon. So everything is nice and flat and lined up here. And I didn't want to put pins through that ribbon either, so anyway, we have it clipped here, and I'm ready to sew the ends of the bag shut. And just a reminder, you just want to make sure your zipper is open. So I'm just pulling 2-inch strips out of my scrap bag. And so this whole bag, I do my scraps, like I'll have like the big, like 2-gallon Ziploc bags. I just have them by color. So like this is my green bag. I pulled the green out, and then I have the strips, and I have, whatever pieces, but that's like all in my green bag. So I do it that way because when I quilt, I can't think of a time I wouldn't pull fabric by its color. So that's why I do it that way. So here we're going to sew this seam, and just making sure that, again, that ribbon is flat, everything is lined up. But this seam is going to be 3/8 of an inch to a 1/2 inch. So I would call that a scant 1/2 inch. You want it a little bit less than a 1/2 inch. We're just going to sew that down. And the reason why we're doing that is since we have so many edges there. We have the ribbon edges and our zipper edge and the quilted fabric edge. It's a lot going on, and we don't want to have anything get misaligned there. So then I just give it a little bit bigger seam. So now I'm just going to pop that inside out, make sure that everything is looking correct. So we've done this seam, and at the same time we've added our little binding strip there as well. So everything looks good. So, but I'm checking it before I finish that binding strip. So now I'm going to make sure that binding strip is kind of out of the way, and then I'm going to cut that extra fabric off here. And now we can just use that binding strip to finish this off. Now since we did a little bit bigger seam, this binding strip is going to have a little less fabric we can fold over, but that's okay. It still works perfectly fine. But this is why for projects you might see them calling for different size binding strips, because it matters the size of what you're sewing onto and your seam allowance and everything. And you might need a bigger strip or a smaller strip. But typically it's around 2 inches. So now I'm just bringing that around, and I'm going to sew this seam. But the other part of this is the fact that you're sewing this initially, and then with a binding strip, you're bringing it back around and sewing it again. You're basically sewing a double seam there, and that just makes this bag that much stronger. The other thing good about these binding strips for this project is it gives it a nice, like stiff edge here, so that everything sits really square when the bag is done, because it has like an extra, almost like an extra, the word I'm thinking of is scaffolding, but you know what I mean, like an extra structure to the bag. Okay, so now I'm just making sure this is all lining up, and then I'm going to sew this seam the same exact way. So I'm going to add my binding strip to this, and I'm going to sew between 3/8 and a 1/2 inch. So we would call that a scant 1/2 inch. So in other words, you're on the shorter side of a 1/2 inch. And I'm just pulling like fabrics that are a little Christmassy. So this bag, like if I want to give it as a gift, which I'm thinking about doing, then it's Christmassy, but yet then someone could use it all year because it's just green. It's not like overtly Christmassy on the outside, but then on the inside, I'm using little scraps that are Christmas fabrics. I just think it's a really cute way of doing this. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to sew this seam, and then I'm just going to peek and make sure that it is, you know, everything is lined up and correct, and then I'm going to finish that off. So now we're doing these corner seams. And all we're going to do is kind of pop that out, and we're going to line up. This is where we trim those 2.5-inch squares out of the corners here. And so we're just going to pin that really good, because these corners, this isn't difficult to do, but it does want to pull so that it's not straight. So you do have to kind of make it straight and pin it or clip it and kind of keep it. See how I'm battling it a little bit? Because it's on the corner, it's a diagonal. It wants to keep moving out of position. So like I said, it's not difficult at all. It's just something you need to, you know, be checking it a few times. And here on this edge, so these are our last 4 corners we're sewing. Now with our binding strips here, we're going to leave a tail on both ends. And we'll be folding that in so that now the entire inside of the bag is, all those seams are finished off. So same thing with a quilt. This is what you would do. It's kind of hard to explain, but let's just say on the corners of a quilt, you would leave this little overhang. So on the first step here, we're just going to sew it on like normal, but we're leaving about 1.25 inches. That's what I find I like. And you can see this kind of got misaligned already. So just checking this a few times before I go ahead and sew it. Because it just wants to keep pulling a little bit out of being a straight line here. So since from the front here, I can't quite see where I start sewing, I'm just going to flip it over there. And it doesn't matter which side you're doing it from. But now we're back to that 1/4 inch seam, not a 1/2 inch seam, but a 1/4 inch seam. So I'm just going to add that strip, and then I'll show you how to finish that off when we have, basically what we're doing is we're cleaning up those corners like we were wrapping a Christmas present. That's exactly how it works. And once you get the hang of this, it's really fun. I love using these binding strips. It seems kind of like it would be an extra thing or a pain or something like that, but no, actually it makes life so much simpler. I really love using these. And it's so funny for me, like making things like this, it looks like such a ragamuffin kind of a thing until that final step when everything is just really cleaned up. So if your project, you're not thrilled with it, I think that's totally normal until the very end, and then I think you'll be really happy with it. So I just basically pulled that strip, and I'll show you the bottom edge so you can see it again, but look how neatly that finishes that off. And the reason why, like, I just do 1.25 inches, and you may feel comfortable doing a different one, but for me it's just enough to cover that edge, but it's not so much fabric that I'm kind of battling extra fabric. So it just kind of feels like the right amount to do. But obviously you do whatever feels comfortable for you. So I just fold that over. And I'll show you again here. Just folding in the edge. And then we're doing like we normally do. Folding it in 1/4 inch and then over again. And I try to make sure that it's kind of neat and tidy before I go ahead and sew it. So like if things are sticking out like they are, I just kind of squish them in there. And if it's really a problem, I'll just refold the whole thing. But the whole point of this is we're just trying to make this look super finished. So these edges at this point, I would say are getting a little bit bulky. So I just sew slowly. That's kind of my fix to sewing anything. If it was really bulky, you could hand crank your sewing machine and that would go through. So I got a little tuck here. So a lot of times when this happens, I just kind of like run my fingernail over it and that fixes it. So if you do get a tuck, try to fix it that way before you're picking the seam out, because a lot of times you don't have to. You can just, it's usually a little wrinkle or a little tuck, and then you can just kind of like straighten it out with your fingernail. So in this case, you see we have a seam going to, it kind of flop to one side or the other. Same thing with our long bottom seam there. So you just want to make sure it flops the same direction. Otherwise, you might have a little twist in your bag. And we're going to do these 4 corners the exact same way, and then our bag is actually done. So we're going to do the 4 corners with that little 1.25 inch tails hanging out on all the 4 corners, and then we fold that in like the gift. And that way all of our raw edges are covered, and the inside of the bag is completely, you know, everything is finished off. So. Okay, so now we've done all 4 corners. And you can see I've used scraps for those binding strips there, but it's nice. It doesn't look, you know, silly or anything. I think it really looks nice because they're similar to each other in color, so I think that looks really nice. So now we're going to pop this bag out, and all we do is just, you know, push those corners out with your fingers. And you can still see those quilting lines, but those will wear off pretty fast. So. But this is a very nice big bag. Been wanting to do this size for a long time now, so I'm really excited to be able to do that. You'll find other videos on my channel where we're doing smaller quilted bags, and they fit inside of this. So that's how big this bag is, and I love it. So it's 12 inches long, it's 5 inches high, 5 inches wide, and we had those little ribbon tabs, and I just actually threaded more ribbon through that tab. And then I'm kind of doing like a big ribbon on each side, and then one I did through the zipper pull as well. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you enjoy this project. So thank you so much.